Throughout its 32-year-long history, Fire Emblem has featured a number of feminine men, or men who otherwise defy gender stereotypes. Sometimes this is unintentional, such as everyone assuming Midir is a lady until he uses he/him pronouns. Other times it is very much intentional on their part, such as the running gag that everyone thinks Lucius is a girl, or everyone thinks Libra is a girl. Honestly, most of these characters boil down to the running gag of them getting very upset that everyone assumes they're a girl. I think it's an anime trope. I'm not super experienced in anime, so I apologize if I'm missing something. There's a cultural disconnect there. Two of these characters, however, stand out amongst the rest and trigger endless amounts of the hashtag discourse. I am, of course, talking about Forest from Fire Emblem Fates and Rosado from Fire Emblem Engage. They are both characters who embrace quote-unquote traditionally feminine attributes, with Forest loving to sew clothes and wear dresses, and Rosado having an obsession with cuteness and very long cotton candy-ish hair. This has, of course, led to conversation around the gender of it all, with both of these characters. There was a long period of time when the Forest trans conversation was a big part of Fire Emblem discourse. With Rosado, I see the beginnings of a similar conversation. And I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the way the conversation is going. Now, before we go any further, I do want to go ahead and say I don't think there's anything wrong with having headcanons about Fire Emblem characters, or any fictional characters for that matter. For example, I myself subscribe to a reading of Ike as homoromantic and asexual, simply based on the way he acts in the story, fitting into that interpretation. And so, in my headcanon, that's what it is. As part of this, I can point to areas of the text such as his reactions to Elincia and his connection with Soren and Ranulf to a lesser extent that I feel support this headcanon, but at the end of the day, it is just a headcanon, or at the very most, a theory. If you want to headcanon that a specific character is trans or gay or whatever, that's perfectly fine. In fact, most works of media don't have things in them that directly contradict a character being trans or queer of some flavor. So if you headcanon that Rosado is bisexual or identifies as a femboy or something like that, that's perfectly fine. That's not what I'm talking about in terms of being an issue the way that we talk about Rosado. No, my issues are twofold. The first is a seeming desire to categorize Rosado just based on his appearance, and oftentimes the very initial impressions of his appearance. And the second is a hatred of Rosado for what he is not. I'll start by talking about that second one, because while on the surface it's definitely worse, it also feels like it is less frequent and easier to point out the ways in which it is harmful and just not a great way to approach media. Now, I totally understand the desire for Fire Emblem to have a canon trans character. There is a very large portion of the Fire Emblem fanbase that is trans, or otherwise has some gender stuff going on. And representation is important. We like seeing ourselves in media, or people like ourselves in media. It's the same reason why I feel like there should be more black and brown characters in Fire Emblem. A trend which has been getting better, although we are still a predominantly white franchise, unfortunately. However, the sentiment that a character is bad simply for not being part of a specific marginalized demographic is, well, I mean, it's kind of nonsense. I don't really know where the logic is, and as such, there's not really much I can say to respond to it. I've seen comments both on Reddit and Discord talking about how Rosado is evidence that IS are cowards, or Rosado sucks because he's not a real trans character. And, like, I don't know, I get the desire for representation, but it's frustrating to see that energy directed towards shitting on another character. Are we late enough in the video that I can say shitting yet? I feel like we are. Now, to me, this feels distinctly different than the criticism of, for example, Devdon and Danved for being minstrel show characters when Fire Emblem hadn't had a black character before then. Because while a minstrel show character is, you know, bad and racist, a man who likes cute things isn't really transphobic. And that sort of dovetails us into the other way that people have been talking about Rosado, and that is the desire to instantly categorize him or instantly get people's reactions to him. I've been watching quite a few streams of Fire Emblem Engage, and frequently I've seen people ask streamers or other chat members what their opinions of Rosado are. Oftentimes before he joins or in the first map where he appears as an enemy. It feels like they desire what would probably be shallow analysis of Rosado's entire character just based on his design and the way that he appears. Which, granted, it's a standout design, but plenty of characters in this game have pretty polarizing designs, and I feel like Rosado gets singled out more than almost anyone other than perhaps Alir with the whole Toothpaste Chan jokes. Additionally, oftentimes the questions are about what do you think of Rosado as a character rather than what do you think of Rosado's design. Now, Rosado isn't a huge character within the story, so in order to get his full characterization, you really have to dive into the supports, because in story he only appears in like 4 or 5 cutscenes, and as a minor role in all of them. Thankfully, all of Rosado's supports are already documented on YouTube, free for anyone to watch through in order to get a better grasp of his character, which is exactly what I did for this video essay. In looking through them all, he definitely steals closer to one note than some other characters, but there is depth there. His big thing is an obsession with cuteness. He wants to be the cutest and will not settle for anything short of the superlative, an attitude that we see reflected in his support with Fogado. He also has a desire to share the appreciation of cuteness with others, which we see in his supports with both Marin and Mavier. He worries about inadequacy and an inability to measure up, which is something we see in his supports with Goldmary and Fogado. However, one thing that we consistently do not see is any question around gender identity or gender issues or the gender of it all. Rosado doesn't express any insecurity around his gender identity, and neither do his peers, which is refreshing considering how much of Forest's supports were, wait, you're a boy and you like dresses? What's going on with that? Because, and prepare for this bold statement, despite his appearance and his obsession with something that is traditionally considered to be feminine, i.e. cuteness, Rosado is a boy. Shocking, I know, considering his supports revolve around things that would be considered traditionally feminine, like cooking or your beauty regiment, but yeah, Rosado is a boy. The game says he, him, he's treated as male for all of the skill procs that rely on gender, and never once does he express any questioning around being non-binary or trans woman or any of that stuff. Feel free to headcanon him as a trans man if you want. I mean, his hair is literally blue and pink, but he's not a trans woman and he's not non-binary. And in fact, the game is explicit about this. Now, I've already seen a couple of rumblings that he's just a closeted trans woman, an argument that actually was surprisingly common around Forest as well, and I really, really dislike. Now, I'm going to say some negative stuff about this particular point of view, but I do want to go ahead and clarify. I don't think that anyone is a bad person if they assumed that Forest or Rosado or any similar characters were trans women who haven't come out yet. However, I do think that these sorts of assumptions are an example of and a symptom of what I like to call egg culture, which is a sort of cultural viewpoint within the trans community that I find to be particularly problematic. And I know by saying the word problematic, I've just become a parody of myself, but bear with me, I swear I have a point. Oftentimes people, and this is especially true for trans people, will see cisgendered characters, or in even worse cases, cisgendered people, acting in a way that does not fill traditional gender roles and label them as an egg. Now, for the one member of my audience who is not a trans person, I'll go ahead and explain. An egg is a term for a trans person who doesn't realize that they're trans yet. And most frequently it is used to talk about oneself in the past. For example, when I was an egg, I stayed up for 5 hours thinking of what the name I would go by if I was a girl was. But I was totally cis. I was definitely cis. That's a normal thing that normal cis people do, is they oftentimes lay awake for 5 hours in bed thinking about what their name would be if they were trans but they're not trans. That's a real life example from my real life, but that's the sort of thing that I feel is, a harmless way to use the term egg. Unfortunately, there is a tendency to apply the term egg to people other than oneself. And that's where things get a little bit not so great. Now, I want to clarify. If this is something that you have done in the past, or even that you are doing now, I don't think you're a terrible person, and I understand where the attitude comes from. Oftentimes, especially for those of us who transitioned later in life, there were signs early on that were just like, if only I had noticed these things, I would have transitioned earlier and I would have been happier much earlier. And so there's the desire to, when you see someone else going through an experience that you perceive to be similar to your own, help them to realize, so that they realize earlier than you and they don't have to go through the long periods of unhappiness from prior to transition. And so I understand that that is a feeling and a desire that comes from a good place, I would say. Unfortunately, it is still pushing a label and identity onto someone who that may not apply to. And I would say, in addition to potentially causing harm to them, causes harm in general in that it enforces rigid gender stereotypes. By saying that any character, or in some of the more extreme cases, any person who doesn't conform with traditional gender norms must be a closeted trans person, you are kind of saying that binary people should conform with their traditional gender roles. And while sure, for some of us who were totally cis men who just like wearing dresses, it turned out that that was a early sign that they're actually trans people. There's other cis men who just like wearing dresses and being cute, and that doesn't make them any less of a man. And that sort of real life tangent aside, this brings us back to Rosado and the conversations happening around Rosado. And while I do think for the most part it is appreciation for the most feminine of femboys that we have had in Fire Emblem, which I am all here for because I love Rosado's design and I'm a fan of his character too, I do feel the need to speak up about the rumblings of transness or gender funk going on there, because Rosado's not a trans woman and Rosado's not non-binary. He might be a trans man, he might be a cis man. I somehow doubt that Intelligent Systems is going to have him turn to camera and say, I was born with a vagina, but I am a man. But, the DLC hasn't come out yet, so maybe. Regardless, though, it's worth remembering that Rosado is a man that likes cute things, that engages in behaviors like beauty regimens and cooking and sharing cuteness and drawings with all of his friends, and has long, flowing, multicolored hair and puts ribbons on his wyverns, and it doesn't make him any less of a man, and it doesn't mean there's funky gender stuff going on underneath there. And if your headcanon is that he's a trans man, that's a-okay. If your headcanon is that he's a cis man, that's a-okay. But he is a man, and I don't like the limiting that comes from taking these characters, or, unfortunately in some cases, real-life people who don't conform to society's binary gender roles, and saying, well, that must not be a man. Because I get where it's coming from. I get that it is coming from a good place, a either desire to see oneself represented in media, or a desire to help others avoid years of unhappiness prior to transition, or just a recognition of this is something that I went through and I can relate to this character. But at the end of the day, we need to believe people, and fictional characters included, when they tell us their gender. And when you claim that a character who looks and acts like Rosado is actually non-binary or a trans woman, you're kind of making the argument that he's not a real man, simply based on the way that he dresses and the way that he acts. And that's not good. That's not an argument that you want to make. I know y'all. Anyway, those are my mostly unscripted thoughts on Rosado. Hopefully I articulated my points pretty well. And hopefully I made it clear. I don't think anyone is a bad person for having a fan fiction or fan canon or headcanon around any character. But I also think we need to be careful how we put people into boxes. And like, I get that it's a video game character, and video game characters don't have feelings, and so, you know, Rosado's not gonna cry because he called him not a real man, but, you know, the way we talk about media does influence the way that we think about people. Anyway, thank you for watching the video. Click like if you liked it. Click subscribe if you want to see more. Join the Discord if you want to join the Discord. I don't know. We chat about Fire Emblem and Pokemon and play Jackbox sometimes. And, bye. I don't know how to end this thing. I'm bad at ending videos. Bye.